Oh, there you go. The husband of the town. Like the whole gang is in here. Everyone's in
All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala sayyidil anbiya wal mursalin, nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. Today, inshallah, yeah, no problem, man. Do you? So, can you just, can you unplug the cable and plug it back in, please? It's being finicky. No. Go back in. Did you put it back in?
Was it not back in? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So today, inshallah, we're going to talk about basically cursing and using obscenity and these type of things. We had talked about before. We said that using curse words or using obscenity in and of itself is what? Is makruh, right? It's something that's disliked. But he's going to talk about why does he keep doing that?
Don't curse, Chef. Don't curse.
I'm about to. I'm like this close, man. But I'm sorry. My mic is on, yes. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. So you're in charge of every time this, all right? Okay, yes. So basically, he talks about that this is something that's looked down. He says it's not permitted, not in the sense like in a Shara'i sense that it's haram, but he says not permitted. It says this is something that a Muslim should prevent themselves from doing or prevent themselves from falling into. And he says that the source of this, the need to use these words or the need to use this obscenity, a lot of it is based on either vileness or malignance and this need to hurt others. And we had said that a lot of these things, they stem from this idea, or they stem from what? If I have a need to hurt others, where is that usually stemming from? All right, it's that hatred, or it's like my own ego, because when I put others down, what does it do for me, or what does it supposedly do for me? Right, it's a way for me to feel uplifted. Most of the time that doesn't work though. Here, there's a couple narrations. There's a number that he mentions. I've just selected a few that I wanted to share to be representative of what some of the content is that the believer does not insult the honor of others, nor curse, nor commit fahisha, nor is he foul. This hadith is in Tirmidhi. Allah does not love the loud and coarse, nor the one who shouts in the markets, right? So just being loud, being obnoxious, and just being harsh, being coarse, being insulting, these are all characteristics that we as believers should always try avoiding. He defines it that as an expression of all things offensive using sharp language. And he's going to get into very specific details. And it's actually, his analysis is, it's excellent as usual. There are very few times where Ghazāli does not amaze me, honestly. And again, this is something that was written about 900 years ago. So he says this mostly happens when individuals start talking about sex or anything that's sexually related. And even if you think a lot of the obscene words in our language, they revolve around that subject, right? So a lot of the obscenities that revolve around, even in our daily discussion, it has to do with things of sexual nature. And he says that, that's one part of it. The second part of it is that who will you find using that language regularly? Is people who are corrupt, right? People who are corrupted in the way that they speak, the way that they present themselves, the way that they talk. He says versus people who are upright. So when people who are upright or people who are righteous, when they talk about these same subjects or they talk about these same issues, you'll find that they won't use the same coarse language, right? They'll always try to use some type of nickname, or they'll use some type of alternative word for it, or they'll use some type of I don't want to say imagery, but they'll use some type of sign language or representation to talk about those same subjects without being as coarse, without being as vile, without being as offensive. So a nice example that he brings is this narration of Ibn Abbas, where he says that Allah is modest and generous, even showing modesty in his an allusion to the idea of particular terms. Specifically, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about sex, right? When he talks about sexuality, he uses the term touching, right? He doesn't even use that word, right? He doesn't even go to that base. He doesn't even go to like that carnal expression. He uses it in a very metaphorical and a very allegorical way, but in a way that is very easy for us to understand. Some examples he gives is that there are some substitutes for certain words like touching or entering on or even intimacy. So like all of these, he says these are reasonable ways of expressing the same content without being as coarse, without being as vile. And he said that all these other terms are usually considered corrupt. He said, as for those terms that are considered evil, then even their mention is offensive, some worse than others. So he's like, okay, these are good examples. I'm not giving any bad ones, right? And the reason that I'm not giving them is just they're just so offensive and they're so vile that I don't want to share them with you. And the thing is, even those things, they're set by society, right? So how do I know what terms are offensive and what terms are not offensive? It's going to be set by different cultures. Different cultures use certain terms and they use certain terminologies in certain ways and in different ways. So there might be, even in our culture, I remember I was talking about to someone there, when I talk to my kids, there are two references that I make sure that they never refer to. Like, so if they have a question about something, there are two places I always tell them don't go. What are those two places? Google's number one. Yeah. And why else? And they're friends. So these two places, I'm like, hey, listen, you guys have any questions? Hadr, I'm here. I have no problem. We actually have an encyclopedia at home, so I'm like, you guys are more than welcome to look it up. And why? Because encyclopedia, at least I have a little bit more control, right? You know all the content that's in an encyclopedia versus the encyclopedia of Google, which is just like unlimited information. And not just that. And again, I don't mean to be coarse in any way, shape, or form, but there are certain things that we could find as very much innocent, but there is a lot of malice that's behind them, especially if they look these terms up on Google. Something as simple as teabag, right? This is something that's very innocent, but if you go and look it up, there is a malicious intent behind it, and there is a sexual reference that's associated with it. And the person who's searching it up, they might just be looking up the contents or where they can find it, or like it's a very innocent search that they're doing for it, but because of the sexual connotation that's related to it, and that's probably specific to American culture, right? This is not something that is a worldwide phenomenon. There's certain, and even within America, you're only going to find within certain pockets of people. It's not like everybody's going to be, well versed in all these terms. Don't look it up, please. So, and again, these are determined by society. Every culture is going to have, they're going to have a different gradient. Yes.
There's a level of like subjective morality.
For sure. And it's like not morality in the sense that, okay, this is evil, because like we said, the base hukum on language is that it is, even if it's something that's bad, is what? Is makruh, right? That's the base ruling on that. So to say there's no real morality associated with it, but the people who you will find that people who tend to lean toward more a corrupt spectrum, they're going to be using that terminology a lot more than somebody who doesn't lean in that direction. And even that, people who use vulgarities and obscenities and like this type of terms, you'll find that a lot of times they're using those terms because they're just not as eloquent, right? They're not unable to express themselves because either they've decided not to read, or there are many of us who revel in our ignorance, right? Like we just enjoy our ignorance, and it's easier for us to express ourselves in that particular way. And this is related to a very important foundation in the Sharia. If there are certain things that the Sharia is silent on, if there are certain things that the Islamic law is silent on, where do I turn to get rulings now? I have to turn to the customs of the people. And some people might be like, okay, well, what do you mean? Like, what type of customs? If I go to the coffee shop and there's a complete outsider, somebody who's not familiar with the culture at all, he comes with me to the coffee shop and I'm like, hey, let me get a cup of coffee. Right. And he's like, what is this espresso thing? Oh, well, it's really good. It's just really strong coffee. He's like, okay, let me get a cup of espresso. And when they both bring us the cups, what's going to happen?
Two different cups.
Right. There's going to be two different amounts. He's going to be like, what the heck? Like, this is like, I got this much drink and you have an entire cup. I got ripped off. But anybody else in the cafe or anybody else in the coffee shop, what are they going to say? Nothing. It's gonna be totally normal. But who dictated that we can only drink this much espresso? Who dictated that? Just society, right? It's just a cultural norm. It's just something that we are aware of. There's certain colors that are allowed for certain people, and there's certain colors that aren't allowed in other societies. Like, for example, me wearing a purple like toga type thing. Would I draw attention if I walked around? Yeah, I would draw a lot of attention if I walked around. But if I was like in Ghana or in Senegal, would I draw as much attention? No, right? Why? Because it's part of their culture, right? So every culture, they dictate and they use different colors, they use different measurements. There are different ways to perceive certain things, and it's something that's really it's really normal. What I found really interesting is have you guys seen the new Dune movie? It's really good, but like so I mean I saw it because I'm really into the books. I had read the entire series, but there's one scene in the movie where one of the sand people, he comes in to greet, right? He comes in to greet the guys, and he sees the emperor, and he walks in and he spits on the table. In our culture, if somebody came and spat on the table, what would happen? Right? It's super insulting. It's super insulting. So the guy who was the translator with him, he was like basically like a cultural translator. He goes like to kind of quell the situation. He's like, "Thank you for offering your water. They're desert people." And this is his way of honoring us by offering the water. So again, it's just cultural context is something that's really important. It's to keep these things in mind. There are certain terminologies, those are dictated by culture. There's certain clothing, there's dictated by culture. And these things are always important to keep in mind when we talk about that. So the urf does have a role. The urf does definitely play a role. In certain cultures, asking for things like, so when you go to get married, there are certain cultures, if you go in, I think when I was going to propose to my wife and I asked her father, like, is she a virgin? I'd probably get kicked out of the house. Right? Why? Versus if I was approaching someone here and say, are you a virgin? Would it be a more reasonable question in this society, in this culture? Or no? Oh, everybody's really uncomfortable, right? Now everybody's like, oh man, you got to think of the subcultures, right? It depends, right? It depends, because you're talking about, even in the Muslim community, are you indigenous, right? Are you black and white American? Are you from a certain subculture, whether you're Indo-Pak or whether you're Arab or North African? Everybody has their own culture, right? And everybody has their own subculture, and everybody's going to deal with these issues in different ways. Asking for blood tests, right, before marriage, or getting screened for STDs before marriage. Like, there's some parents that are just like, no, this is not acceptable. Oh, khalas. Okay. Yes. Fahisha is like evil. I guess it's just such a generic term. Yeah, like that's what I'm saying. Like immorality, indecency, evil. Khalas. But that's the concept behind it, right? So it'd be evil, indecency, immorality. So what was I talking about? Oh, the urf, right? So customs, and where do customs play a role? How they affect even rulings Islamically. How they affect rulings even Islamically. There are certain social norms that need to be taken into account when we are getting involved in business transactions, right? Because there's certain understandings that are there, and in those unwritten understandings, they sometimes can have an effect on the nature of the argument, the nature of the contract. So what is the ruling on using these terms? So at best, Ghazāli says that the highest we can hope from using obscene terms or obscene language is that it is what? That is disliked, that is makruh. And he said, and at worst, that it'll be something that is warned from. Like either you would warn from that using such terminology, or you would warn from the person, like actually stay away from that individual. So when we talk about these terms, or these, like Ghazāli, he says that, is it only in sexual terms that obscenity comes and vulgarity comes? No, not necessarily. He said, so the example he gives is actually really beautiful. He said, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about using the bathroom, he uses the term gha'it, right? So what does gha'it mean? Gha'it is actually the act of covering yourself, and the act of hiding yourself and distancing yourself. So even that is an allegory, right? So it's a kinaya to represent relieving oneself, right? He doesn't use the terms to relieve oneself, like to defecate or to urinate. So where else would this apply? So he mentions two examples, and again, these are culturally sensitive issues. In some cultures, when you talk about your spouse, you cannot even take her name. Like you just can't. It's considered aib. It's considered culturally inappropriate to even take your spouse's name when you talk about her. When you're describing someone with a physical ailment, even that depends, right? Even that depends. Saying somebody who has, like, for example, if I say, you're like, hey, do you know so-and-so? Like, who's that? And, he's got alopecia, he's got missing spots of hair. Is that the best way for me to describe him? No, there are other terms. It's like, the brother with the hair, right? You're saying the same thing. You're saying the same thing, but you're saying it in a way where you're trying not to be insulting and you're trying to hide that shortcoming. You're trying to hide the handicap of that person. And like I said, even with the spouse, all of this is culturally based. There are some cultures where it's strange, again, to even mention your spouse's name. So what do some cultures do and how do they get around it? They'll say the mother of so-and-so, and they'll take their eldest child's name. So there's a nice story here of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. So he was extremely shy, and we noticed that there was a lump in his armpit. So they're like, oh man, how do we tell him? Like, how do we express this issue? This is something that's strange. So we asked him. They said, because he was aware of it, and they're like, hey, where's your lump, or where's this lump? So he said, it's in my underarm, versus saying it's in my armpit. Again, it's just a matter of understanding how to use certain terminologies and using things in a way that are less abrasive than other terms. So what causes a person to use foul language? There are internal and external factors. Those internal factors are someone who just intends on hurting people, right? So a person who will constantly use obscene language and foul language, the reason that he or she uses it is because they want to hurt people. The other reason is because they surround themselves with bad people, right? If I am constantly around people who use obscenities, who use vulgarities, eventually what's going to happen to me? I'm going to start using those terms, and I'm going to start speaking like that myself. So it's important for me to avoid that situation. There's a example here where, or a hadith here that's in Adab al-Mufrad. Is basically, I came to the Prophet ﷺ when he was wrapped up in a cloak and whose edges were covering his feet. And I said to the message of Allah, Awsini, advise me. So he said, you must have a fearful awareness of Allah, or you must have taqwa. It's a bad translation. It should be God consciousness. Is that do not scorn anything correct, even pouring water from your bucket into the bucket of someone else who asks you for water, or talking to your brother with a happy face. Like, don't look down on anyone. Don't look down on anyone, and don't even try to control even your facial expression when dealing with other people. And then he says, beware of dragging your waist wrapper. It is part of arrogance, and Allah does not like it. So this has to do with isbal. Isbal is when you allow your garment to drag purposely out of arrogance, right? So if you're not doing it out of arrogance, then it's permissible. If a man blames you for something he knows about you, do not blame him for anything you know of him. It's, again, something that's really important. And sometimes, what do? We end up playing this blame game. If somebody says something bad about me, automatically, what am I? Well, you. Right? And it's a very natural response that we have. That when somebody says something like, well, you shouldn't have done this. Well, okay, how about the time you did this? Did I benefit anyone? I'm not even listening to what he's saying. I didn't even acknowledge what he said to me. Immediately I retorted. Why did I retort? Or why did I respond? All right, I get defensive. Why am I getting defensive though? Essentially, what am I saying? If someone says to me, like, hey, listen, you said something that was inappropriate. And I'm like, well, yeah, you are always inappropriate. Huh? I'm not accepting it, right? Essentially what I'm doing is I'm dismissing what you're saying. Why am I dismissing what you're saying? It's because you are not worthy to give me advice, right? That's essentially what's happening. By me putting you down, saying that you are not in a place and you're not in a space where you're allowed to advise me. And then it goes on to say that if a man blames you for something he knows about you, don't blame him for anything you know about him, and leave him to his own evil. You will have your reward. Do not abuse anything. Again, a very beautiful story. Something I really enjoyed. When you have two people indulge in hurling insults upon one another, same scenario, right? Someone is coming and telling me something, and they could have ill intent, right? They can have ill intent. I had someone come to see me one time. It's like, well, you don't know this and that and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, Jazakallah khair, I'm trying to learn. And that was just, that was just so insulting to them. And they were because they were trying to get a response, right? And what do we call that? I think we've used this term before. An instigator in modern terminology, a troll, right? So they're just trying to get a response, right? They're just trying to get a response out of us. And this is something that don't feed the troll, right? Very simply. That's it. And how do I not feed the troll? By not engaging with what they're saying. Tafadhal.
Isn't there a case with Abu Bakr and Umar?
Yeah, and he responded.
Can you clarify that? Like, I'm not too sure.
Okay, so basically the story of Abu Bakr is now he's dealing with someone who is younger than him and someone who doesn't have the same social standing as him, right? So when you have someone in that situation, is it okay to be insulting if you're trying to get a particular point across. So over here, if you have somebody who is, and I'm not saying this is the ideal response, because if you look at the seerah of the biography of the entirety of Abu Bakr's life, how many cases do we have where he's actually using vulgarity? Right, you have these 1 or 2 cases where he's doing that. So if you're looking at that and looking at who he's dealing with, like he must have said something to really agitate him or aggravate him, either about Islam or about Allah or about his Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And in this situation, he was speaking about Allah. So then how did Abu Bakr respond? So you have this individual now who is cursing Allah. So Abu Bakr, he responds to him. And so he says to him, he says, Umsus bidar Allah. He says, why don't you go lick Lat's clitoris? And he was just being vulgar with him. Why? Because he wanted to just shut him up. He wanted to shut him up. And again, if you look at the entirety of the biography of the Prophet, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, this is the one situation where he's actually responding to someone who's cursed him. Otherwise, you find him extremely patient. You find him extremely forbearing. You find him extremely eloquent. He's not someone who would stoop to these levels. So if you have 1 or 2 situations where somebody loses their cool, I think he, out of everyone, is very deserving of that. Radiallahu anh. Yes. You had a question?
Sorry, I was just throwing a line.
Oh, okay.
That's what I said.
All right. So again, it's important to understand and maintain our composure when we are dealing with one another. This is why afu, and this is why forgiveness is a concept that is constantly pushed on, because it's difficult to gauge, right? You know, how much am I allowed to respond to the person in front of me? You know, there's no clear metric there on the amount of response that person is deserving, because the amount of hurt that we receive individually is always going to what? It's always going to be different, right? It's always going to vary. For someone who grew up in a culture, like, you know, I'm talking about myself, that I grew up in a culture where we'd constantly be hurling insults at each other. You know, bully culture was something that was really common. How did you end up, or how did you get out of being bullied? By being a stronger target, by being a more difficult target. And how do you end up being a more difficult target? By learning how to respond, because they'll go and search for the weaker target at that point. So what happens is you have tougher skin. If somebody insults you, what do? You don't care. You just kind of move on, and you develop that skill set, or you develop that strength. If you grow up in a culture where you don't have to deal with that, and you don't have that constant abrasion, will you have how strong is your spirit going to be? Right, it's going to be very weak, right? If you're constantly shielded and you've never had any experience where somebody's insulted you, the first insult that I hear, what's going to happen? Right, I'm going to break down. Right, I'm going to break down, and I'm going to be really brittle. I won't know how to deal with any type of criticism. I won't know how to deal with anybody, how they speak to me, or how they deal with me, or how they talk to me. And the moment someone says to me something, like, all of a sudden, like, I'm broken and I go into depression, and like, and I'm not talking about like mental depression. I'm talking about, like, you know, depression in the moment in my reaction. But we have to learn how to balance. Like, we have to learn how to deal with criticism. We have to learn how to deal with insult, because at the end of the day, the person who's insulting me, why is he doing it, or why is she doing it? Right, their own insecurities, and they just, out of you, what do they want? They just want a reaction, right? They want a reaction because it feeds their ego. And the moment that I give in, what are they going to do? They're masochists, right? So what they're going to keep going. They're like, all right, I got a reaction, so I'm going to push harder so I can get a stronger reaction. Allah protect us. The Prophet ﷺ said, abusing a Muslim is fusuq, is evil, and killing him is kufr, is disbelief. The entire, and this hadith is a summary of the entire chapter on where this actually becomes a problem. When I start using terminology, whether it be vulgar or obscene or not, essentially it becomes haram when? I'm sorry? So when we said that the base ruling for obscenity and vulgarity, we said, is disliked. But looking at this hadith and looking at the context of what Ghazāli is talking about, there is a situation where it is haram, not because of the wording, but because of the result. What situation is that? I'm sorry? When I hurt someone, it doesn't even have to be Muslim. Like, what gives me the right now to disrespect or dishonor a person in front of me? Muslim or not? It doesn't. So even people who we disagree with, in terms of even lifestyle, what gives me now the right to abuse or ridicule this person? If a person falls into a particular sin, whatever that sin might be, a person might suffer from substance abuse. A person might suffer from homosexuality. A person might suffer from a drinking problem. Someone might be a pathological liar. That's their problem. And that's a sin. There's no doubt about it. Does it give me now the right to ridicule them? Is it going to help them come back from their sin? Right? If I sit there and I just start making fun and I throw insults at this person, it's not going to bring him back to Islam. It's not going to bring him back to practice. If anything, what's going to happen? Right? It's going to push him away even further. And this is a problem that we have, like in so many of our masajid, right? We have this judgy, preachy type culture that has actually pushed people away from the masjid. People are scared of coming because they're afraid of being judged. Raise your hand if you like being judged, right? Like no, nobody does. Nobody likes being judged. Even if we're right, like people don't like being judged. Everybody wants to come into a space. Everybody wants to be comfortable. And are we aiding to that? Are we providing that? Or are we not? When we see somebody being abused, and this happens in our masjid, do we allow that abuse to continue? Oh, that's just sister so-and-so being so. Yeah, she can just be a little aggressive like that. Versus taking the sister in our hands or taking the brother in our hand and be like, hey, it's all right, man, don't worry. You know what I mean? At least developing that relationship, say, hey, listen, don't worry about it. He's like that with everyone. Because we can't change everyone, right? We can't. We just don't have the ability to do that. I mean, we barely succeed in changing ourselves, let alone others. Yes.
So I'm gonna put myself out there and say I struggle with
Abusing people.
no, maybe in the courtroom, but I'm talking about when you say like there's an obvious gayness or gay person.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. So when it comes to sinning, we will always be fundamentally against the concepts. So if I have a Muslim that comes in and, for example, is homosexual, or a Muslim that comes in and is a pathological liar, or a Muslim that comes in and has a substance abuse problem, as long as that person isn't advocating, welcome. I have no issue with that. The moment I come in, I start advocating for sin. I'm sorry, Akhi. You're disrespecting our space.
What is advocating?
You tell me.
Well, it might be different concept than I'm thinking because I think
Sure.
advocating doesn't have to be obvious.
In this case, it has to be.
So if it's obvious,
It has to be obvious. Otherwise, how would I know a person is advocating privately? What is it? What would that even look
not
like?
privately, but they do it, on your friend, and then it happens over time.
So here, if a person is trying to, there's a difference between someone trying to slip in their ideas,
Yeah.
right? That is very difficult to judge and it's very difficult to gauge. And we honestly, we don't really even have an idea. And the reason that we don't fight such people is the same reason the Prophet ﷺ didn't fight who? The munafiqeen. If you want to talk about people who openly wanted to destroy Islam, there's no greater group than them. Anyone other than them, who cares? You know what I mean? Like, and why do I say, I don't mean who cares in the sense like, oh, let them do what they want. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about people who scheme against the Muslims and scheme against the ummah, what is our job? We don't really have to do much. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. He said, as for these people who plan privately and plan secretly and who try to undermine you, don't worry about them. Why? I'll take care of them. That's my issue. You only have to worry about what? The open fahisha. You only have to worry about the open issues because the hidden secret stuff, we really don't have control over. There's no way. And the problem is the moment we start saying that, oh, he has an agenda, she has an agenda, they have an agenda. What have we done in the community? We've only created partisanship. Like, and you start sowing doubts in people, be like, well, actually he's with so-and-so or she's with so-and-so. You can't do that. Like that sows the seeds of discord. That's something that we can't do. But somebody comes in and be like, hey, I'm gay and y'all need to be gay. Or somebody comes in like, hey, I drink alcohol, y'all need to drink alcohol. Or like, yo, lying is the best thing. I don't know what's wrong with y'all. Like, that is where we would take a stand, right? Because they're openly now advocating for something that is against the Sharia. But if someone is doing these things privately, I mean, listen, I don't, and please don't raise your hands. Like, how many of us lie? How many of us backbite? Right? These are all major sins. There's no doubt about that. How many of us tail carry? Yeah. Namima. Namima is like, yo, did you hear about so-and-so? Like, it's like gossiping. You know, these are all major sins. These are all kaba'ir. And I'm not, you know, I know I have gotten pushback on this before. People are like, oh, you know, he equates homosexuality to lying. But no, I can't equate any of these things. But at the same time, I can't put any of these on a number scale either, because Allah didn't. Allah didn't say this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, this is number 4. And if he didn't say that, I'm not one to put that. And just because I find something repulsive personally, if I find something repulsive personally, I cannot include that into the gauge where I now judge actions. I just can't. If I find alcohol repulsive, can I now move it to the top of the list of major sins? No, it doesn't work like that. My own repulsion or attraction to something doesn't add to the gauge. What's important to keep in mind is all of these are major sins, and major sins means I have to take special care in what? Avoiding them. It's as simple as that. Like one of the brothers actually came to me, and he was talking about like zina and homosexuality. Blah, blah. I was like, okay, akhi, if your child had a choice between zina and homosexuality, which one do you choose? And he was like, zina. I was like, no, neither. Like I was like, this is not an either or thing. Like you have them avoid sin. Like that's the idea. You have them avoid major sin. That's what we need to teach our children, that regardless of what the sin is, all of these things are ugly, all of these things are despised, and all of these things should be repulsive.
I've had an Imam though that differentiated being gay, committing the sin of sodomy versus zina.
I'm okay with making a differentiation. Like zina is not equivalent to riba. Riba is not equivalent to disrespecting my parents, and disrespecting my parents is not equivalent to lying. They're all different, but what is the scale? And now that I've determined this magical scale of like 1 through 10, how does that affect anything? Very honestly, how does that change anything? In a very practical sense, does it change anything? It's like, now I'm going to take extra effort to avoid being homosexual, right? You know what I mean? It's like, how does it even work? If I determined, said, okay, this is number 2 on the scale, and I'll accept. The worst sin after shirk is what? Sodomy, right? All right, let's accept that. All right, now what? Like I said, very practically, how does that change anything? I don't know. Yeah, it just changes my personal scale. That's it. That's all it does. It's like I'm gonna work extra hard to be, you know what I mean? Like, not gay. I don't. What is it? What is that? What does it even look like? Yeah.
Policy, it affects schools.
So the question is now, for as Muslims, as parents, what are we doing to advocate to protect our children?
Well, thank you for saying that.
That's it. That's all it boils down to. Because the thing is, like, even as a community, like, our politics are all wrong. There are only 2 places that we really need to look into when we look into politics. We need to look into our local government, our local elections, and into our school board. That's it. And I don't even know why we look beyond that. What percentage of the population are we? Does anybody know?
1%.
Not even 1%. And even that 1% is concentrated in particular areas. If you're concentrated in that area, okay, focus on your local government. You really think it's going to make a difference who the president is? I mean, other than on gas prices, damn. Like, but like, I'm saying, like, overall, it doesn't have a big effect. It doesn't have a big change. Yes.
Okay, since we're on the topic of
Yeah.
how do we address these issues in the community? Like, since us who are like less knowledgeable, how do we get those who are more knowledgeable to address the situation? Because I know that it is a taboo topic, and it's not really spoken about as often.
So it depends on what needs to be addressed.
Right.
That's the first
example,
question. Yeah.
Starting like LGBTQ classes in middle schools with younger kids.
So what education are the parents giving to the children? Because here,
Right.
what's practically going to happen is the same thing that happens to any kid who's opted out of sex education.
Right.
What does he do, or what does she do?
They find out about it later.
They hear it from their friends, right? You have the person who you've been sitting next to for the entire year, every single day, is now for 40 minutes going to another class, and you're going to lunch. After you come back, what are you going to talk about? It's like, hey, guess what? Guess what this looks like? You know what I mean? Like that's what's going to happen. All you've managed to do was allow your child access to more disinformation.
So are you saying don't put them in that environment?
No, I'm not. We have to integrate. We don't have any choice except to integrate. So what do? We educate our children. You can excuse them from the classes. I have no issue with that. But we have to educate our kids. Like we have to preempt it. We have to get in. We have to tell them.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember like how old was he at the time? I want to say he was like 8. Yeah, but like Sahad came to me. He's like, he's Baba. What's sex? I was like, whoa. I was like, I'm gonna answer your question. I just need to breathe. You know, I was like, it's kind of early. I wasn't expecting this, but you just introduce these things that, you know, that are age appropriate. You know, you don't start talking about, okay, like, you know, these are genitals and these are this, and this is how this works. And you give age appropriate information. That's what's important. And in sex education can begin, you know, when sex education actually starts? As soon as they start talking. As soon as they start talking, you teach them, if anybody touches you in your private areas, you have to come and tell us. Because now they have that awareness. And if they have that awareness, they have to make sure that they are comfortable with their own body and have the confidence to come and tell you if something happens. And regardless of who it is, that's something that's important. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I mean, I remember, I think it was like Madia was like 6. She came to, she's like, Baba, what's gay? You know, and obviously she heard it in school. So I told her, I was like, listen, it's when men marry men and women marry women, and Islam doesn't allow that. It was enough for her. Because why? Because there were no follow-up questions. But if I just tell her like, no, dude, go read Ayatul Kursi, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, in those thoughts will leave your mind. You know, yes, there are spiritual solutions to things, but this one, there's actually a practical one. Yes.
No, I think that it's great that you need to tie your camel. There's a safety show in one of the documentaries that I watched, and they actually taught kids not to go into a car, a stranger's car.
Yeah.
And they gave them the whole talk.
Yeah.
And this actually happened. They tested it.
And they still went in.
They still did it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And because why? You can't have a one-time reinforcement. Right. There has to be constant reinforcement behind a lot of concepts, behind a lot of ideas. Like, and
Talking about it once is not going to work.
It's not going to work. It's not just like a one time, like, okay, yeah, I red pilled the community, like we're good. Like, no, it doesn't work like that. Like, there has to be constant education and re-education and a revisiting of the topic and a revisiting of the discussion. Like even talking to the kids, like my 12-year-old, when he goes to the doctor, very clear questions. Are you attracted to, you know, are you attracted to the opposite gender or the same gender? But like very specific questions. Like, alhamdulillah, he's attracted to the opposite gender. But like, it's like, so you do get those things, right? You do get those things. So the abuse is the main problem, right? So when these terms used, or whenever we use these terms, and this shows the value that each of us has. Islam, very categorically, it prohibits us from oppressing and hurting others, but it also prohibits us from what? Allowing ourselves to be oppressed. Huh? No, so la darar wa la dirar is that's a little bit different. So that's basically like, I am not allowed to harm others. I'm also not allowed to respond with harm. This is more along the lines of where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sends the angels, and these individuals have passed away, and they asked him, you know, how was your condition on earth? He said, kunna mustad'afina fil ard, that we were weak in the land. And then the angels asked him, alam takun ardullah wasi', was Allah's land not great for you to migrate therein? Very clear that these individuals were in situations where they allowed themselves to be oppressed. Like, it's categorically not permitted. I am not allowed to I have no right to stand in front of Allah and complain that this person oppressed me when I allowed myself to be in that situation. This shows the importance of how we define relationships. If I want someone to respect me, what do I need to do? I need to respect myself. How do I respect myself? What do I do? By setting boundaries. And what is one of the easiest ways to set boundaries, ya ikhwan? By saying no. That's it. And it can be difficult, right? It can be. But the easiest way for people, because you know what that does? It gives the person in front of me a flag and an idea of how far they can go with me. But if I'm not giving off those signals, is it fair that like, oh man, he just keeps taking advantage of me? Okay, what are you doing about it? Right? Like, I mean, I'm very, very, very much anti-victim mentality. I understand that people are in situations and they get into situations. I get it. But all I have to do, because at that point, if I don't have it, if I say no and I'm still being abused, and that situation now, I didn't have a choice. At least I tried. And now I have some merit to stand in front of Allah with. That, yeah, Allah, I tried. Versus letting people walk all over me. And like I said, it's as simple as a no. It's as simple as a no. And sometimes that's the most difficult thing. But if we don't instill these characteristics in our children, like if we don't teach them to say no, then they will be having premature sex. They will be taking drugs. They will be lying. They will fall into substance abuse. All of these things that we can even still fall into. Allah protect us and our families. The Prophet ﷺ said, it is one of the greatest sins that man should curse his parents. So it was asked Allah's messenger, how does a man curse his parents? The Prophet ﷺ said, the man abuses the father of another man, and the latter abuses the father of the former and abuses his mother. Like, so he answers even more so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says the same thing about what? لا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله. It's like, do not curse those who they worship other than Allah. Am I going to convince someone to come to Islam if I make fun of them for worshiping a man? Am I going to convince someone to worship Allah if I tell them like, hey, you guys worship like an 8-armed elephant, like you're so stupid, right? It's not going to convince anyone to come to Islam. It's not. How do you think he's going to respond? He's going to take it personally, and he's going to start cursing Allah. Keeping people's responses in mind is something that is vitally important. Like again, this is something that is going to be stressed time and time again. And the connection here between taqwa and khuluq is something that cannot be dismissed. How we develop our relationships with other people, how we deal with them, is a reflection of my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I am bad with people, there's a good chance I'm bad with Allah. And all of these things that you find the Prophet talking about, Siddha Rahim, being kind, being generous, being honest, being upright, all of those things lead to good relationships. They all lead to positivity. They all lead to productivity and fruitfulness. And like I said, if I want to judge my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just look around me. I remember, like, you have people who come obviously for counseling. They're like, I have a bad relationship with my mom and like my friends and bloods and this and da. I'm like, yeah, Habibi, the only commonality that all these people have is you. How is it that every single one of these people has a bad relationship when it comes to you, but they're all dealing with each other? There's a problem there. Now, is it possible that all those people are bad? Maybe, but the chances of that are usually pretty low. So where does this shyness not apply? Is there a situation where we can be more explicit? So being explicit, and I don't want to use the word, I mean, even being vulgar sometimes. Are there situations where that's okay?
Vulgar or not shy?
Explicit. Let me use the word explicit.
In Islamic knowledge?
Right, when it comes to knowledge. Like, there's no doubt about it. And when it comes to educational purposes, like there has to be sometimes some explicit involved, even from the Prophet ﷺ, where a woman came to him and she said, can I borrow your mask? A woman came to him and she had just been recently divorced for the 3rd time from her previous husband. And she wanted to get back with her previous husband. And she was married to the new husband. And she came to the Prophet ﷺ, and she said to him, she was like, she said, I was like, he's like this. So the man said, he's like, oh yeah. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, these are my 2 sons. He's like, I don't have any problems. And the Prophet ﷺ said to her, he said that you cannot ask for a divorce, you cannot initiate anything thinking you're going to get back with your حتى تذوق صيلتها ويذوق صيلتك. That until you penetrate her and until she's penetrated. Like, just very clear. The only other, there's in one other situation this applied when it comes to judiciary. That's the only other situation where it's needed. When Ma'az came to the Prophet ﷺ saying that, hey, listen, I committed zina. So the Prophet ﷺ, he turned away. He's like, okay, you know, he's like, okay, leave, like, you know, don't tell me. And he came back. He's like, yeah, Rasul, I committed zina. And then he turned away again. He said, I committed zina. So he said, where are your people? They're like, is he crazy? Is he okay? They're like, no, he's fine. Like, we don't know him to be like, you know. So he asked him very explicitly, he's like, did you enter her? And he said, yes. So when it comes to educational reasons, when it comes to judiciary reasons, in these cases, it is okay to be explicit because there is an intent behind that. And not just that, you're not trying to what? What is this whole chapter revolves around what? Hurting people, right? You're not trying to intentionally hurt someone or be malicious. So these are the things, I think this is the last slide until the next chapter. Huh? Yeah, there's no haya in ilm. Even when so it reminds me, there's another hadith, and we'll close with this. There's a hadith of Salama, a Madani woman. She comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and she sits down to him. She's like, Ya Rasulullah. She's like, what does a woman do if she has a wet dream? So Salama, her face turned red, and she covered her face, and she's like, what are you doing? Like, and she was like, la haya fil ilm. She's like, there's no shyness and knowledge. I need to know this, you know, like, subhanAllah. So you do have situations like that. But like I said, you know, when it comes to educational reasons, when it comes to judiciary, there should be no shyness in asking. There should be no shyness in seeking. It's completely normal. Like it's important to understand the situation too. Like if I'm attending like a kid's class, I'm not going to ask like, you know, it's like teacher, like, you know, it's not, you know, that's not going to be appropriate. But as long as there is a means of communication established between you and somebody who you trust and knowledge, then utilize it. There's no reason not to utilize it. Even if you might feel it's inappropriate, that's for the mufti or the scholar to judge. That's not for you to judge. He will tell you what those boundaries are. If he's doing his job, or he's a pervert. I mean, one of the two. But like these are things that are important to keep in mind. You know, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and our families. Ameen. Any questions? Yes.
So I think I have two questions. So number one is when wearing a ring, is there like a specific finger you should put it on? Or should it be like facing, like if there's like a stone, should it be facing you?
Yeah, so this is sunnah idea. This is from the customs of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is not a sunnah that he actually enforced and encouraged others to do. But he sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore it on, there are narrations both on his left and his right hand. And there are narrations where he wore it inward, or he would take it inward when he went to the bathroom, but he would leave it outward. And it was used for stamping and for his seal. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was made out of silver. I think it survived until the era of Uthman and it got lost in a well. Yeah.
Would you say it's a sunnah to wear if you're married or something?
No, I mean, it's not haram either. Like it's neither. Like I would say it's neutral. If people do it out of their customs, I don't see a big deal. I don't see a problem with it because it's a customary thing. Does the Sharia tell us that men can or can't wear rings? Right? No, and not just that. We have a precedence where the Prophet ﷺ actually wore rings. So that shows that there's allowance for it. If you want to use it as a symbolic gesture in particular, you know, ceremony, I don't see a problem with it. I don't see an issue with it.
What
Yeah, I think you had one more question, and then we'll go this way.
Someone else?
Hmm.
If someone's let's say in prison for Iḥyā prayer,
Yeah.
and they come out from the floor and they start making dua,
Hmm.
would you say it's a bid'ah?
No. The Prophet said, you have a very clear hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he came up from ruku', and one of the Sahaba, without unprompted and not taught this, he said, "Rabbana wa lakal hamd hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fi." The Prophet ﷺ, after prayer, he turned around, he said, who said that? He said, I did, Ya Rasulullah. He's like, why do you ask? He said, because I saw two angels descending to write down what you had said. So to having that creative license, there are specific places in the prayer where that's allowed. During the recitation time, no, absolutely not. Right? That's not allowed. But coming up from ruku', there's a license that's there. There's a difference of opinion on the ruku' itself. There is a difference of opinion. Some scholars will say no, you can't. And the sajda is the other place where there's a creative license that's allowed.
So someone like comes out the Quran and they're like,
I mean, that's qunut, and that's different. But you like the important thing is if you're following the Imam, you have to follow the Imam. Like you can't go against him. If you're praying it independently, I don't see an issue. I don't see a problem. Wallahu a'lam. Yes.
Could you explain the hadith again? Like
Which one?
4 or 5 slides back, it was like the Prophet ﷺ talking about someone who's like pouring a bucket into someone else's.
Yeah, basically he was saying don't criticize. Like if you're doing something for someone, like when you're doing somebody a favor, don't change your facial expression. Does that make more sense? Does that help?
Like don't show like
Don't show that you're
tired of, like, giving-
yeah, exactly. That you're trying to help them out, or like, don't have a disfavorable look when you're actually going to help someone. Or if somebody asks you, like if you ask me to like, pour you some water, and I'm like, yeah, okay. Right. It's like obviously you can see it in my face. I'll be like, sure, yeah. And you pour it that way that the person can't tell that you're upset and like you're tired of that. So that's what the hadith means.
And then I had another question was like,
Sure.
I got the point regarding boundaries, and like saying no in terms of like teaching like I guess sex ed to like young children, but like where's the line between, because like how there's like this narcissist almost like self-care culture where it's like boundaries to an extreme where it's like you won't help anyone because it's like infringing upon your own I guess self-care. Like where's like the line between that and then also like I guess
Selflessness,
yeah, like,
and being generous.
but then also like having boundaries and like not getting like
Mhm.
taken advantage of.
I mean, you have to define those. Like different people take pleasure in different things. Like some people, they like helping others. So when people ask them, it's joyful, right? They enjoy that. And we have to make sure that we're doing our contribution and making our contribution. How do we encourage that? Through generosity with time, generosity with money. We should get to a point when it's time to give sadaqah, or when it's time to give zakat, we're doing it happily, right? And I think when these things become a chore, like, so for example, if prayers become a chore for me and I'm not finding enjoyment in it, what do I need to do at that point? Nobody knows, huh? I said, when salah becomes a chore, when it becomes like tedious, what do I need to do, or what should I do? So
like maybe there's something wrong with the offense, like maybe it might be too much.
or maybe my sajda is too long. No, I mean look at my intention, right? Like I really have to reanalyze my intention. I have to remember, why is it that I'm praying? Sometimes we lose focus. Something just becomes such a habit that we forget why we're doing them. And this is why we're constantly like this idea of taqwa and God consciousness. When is it? It's always, right? And what does always mean? It means I always have to keep trying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he doesn't say man ittaqa, he says وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ, that the individual who has God consciousness time and time again, right? Because you constantly have to fight for it and strive for it. It's not something that's easy. And that fight for sincerity is the challenge, right? That's the human challenge. That's the human difficulty. So when things are becoming a chore, I need to go back and look at my intention. And not just that, it's important for me to explore, right? There has to be some spiritual exploration that I think that many of us lack and we fail in, that I need to go out and figure out what is it that I actually enjoy spiritually that will bring me fulfillment. Because the reason that we find that is because the Prophet ﷺ said, أَحَبُّ الْأَعْمَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ أَدْوَمُهَا. He said the most beloved actions to Allah are the ones that are the most consistent. وَإِنْ قَلْ, even if they are small. How do I find consistency? Through discovery, right? I have to explore and figure out what it is that I enjoy and what it is that I like. But if I'm not doing that, if I should sit down, I should read Quran, I should fast, I should pray, I should get involved in social work. There's so many different avenues. We literally have like a buffet of good deeds to choose from. And Allah doesn't obligate us with one particular one. And the reason He obligates us with the 4 pillars that we have is because those are the actions that He loves most. And on top of that, it gives us an introduction to the taste of the variety that's available. So I think this is something to always keep in mind, so these things don't become a chore, and so that we are constantly renewing our intentions.
Okay, can you please
Yeah.
explain briefly about that one hadith that mentions man not being able to wear gold and silver?
Okay, so you have some scholars who try to come up with an illah. You have some things in Islam that are ma'lul, and you have things that are ghair ma'lul.
Right.
Basically, that means is that you have some things where the reasoning is clear, and you have the reasoning is unclear. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibit pork? I don't know. Like, I mean, I was hoping you guys, right? Or why is Salat al-Dhuhr 4 rakat and Salat al-Fajr is 2?
Right.
Right, there are some things we just don't have the reasoning for it. Like, why is alcohol haram? Right, because it prohibits you from having clear judgment, right? It clouds your judgment. So the things that we have a clear rationale for, I can give you the rationale for it. The other ones, it's always going to be conjecture, right? So if I say to you, why can't we eat pork? Well, it's this type of animal, it infers these type of characteristics in the person that consumes it. It's conjecture, right? It's just all, it's all mental math, like, it's just all mental gymnastics that I'm trying to get to, and like maybe I might be able to come up with a reason. Wallahu alam, I don't know. The same thing with gold. Does gold have the same effect on men that it does on women? I don't know. I know that there's some research that's done into that and how gold enters the bloodstream of men and it doesn't enter like the bloodstream of women in the same way. Wallahu alam. I really don't know. Is it something that incurs vanity in men? I mean, I think it looks tacky personally, but like I don't know. I don't know the actual reasoning behind it. Wow.
I'm not sure if there's
Yeah.
a study on it about
Yeah.
like if like men were both mixed and more feminine or girls like silk or something.
No, that's soy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Question on killing a Muslim.
Yeah.
I always wonder, and the hadith says it's kufr. Is it figurative or is it?
It's figurative. No, it's figurative. It's figurative. There's no doubt about that. I mean, like, you have a lot of hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I don't mean to use the word exaggerate in the sense of lying, but exaggerate to show the gravity of that. So one of those things is this, like, killing a Muslim is disbelief. Why, like, you make any and all possible efforts to avoid doing it, right? Or the one who visits the soothsayer, his prayer isn't accepted for 40 days, right? We have this hadith. Yeah, these things again. It's Allah decides what's accepted and what's not accepted. And as far as those 40 days, or the one who drinks alcohol, his prayer isn't accepted for 40 days. Like, is it 40 days exactly? What does that actually entail? Don't do it. Like, what I mean? Like, this, it's not even an issue that needs to be delved into. Why? Because it's something ghaibi, it's something that's unseen. And as for the kufr ma'nawi, it's not like kufr haqiqi where a person actually expels or executed from the fold of Islam. And why do we say that? Because you have the hadith Osama ibn Zayd, where he killed somebody who took the shahada, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said to him, he's like, you killed him, and he said, La ilaha illallah. Had it been an issue of disbelief, he would have said to him, you need to take your shahada again. And Allah knows best. Yes.
So like, I know there's no hierarchy in terms of like LGBTQ versus like XYZ.
Yeah.
But say we have like family member or like a friend.
Yeah.
They openly condone that type of practice.
Yeah.
But they're not even praying yet. Would there be merit in like maybe persuading them to like pray first and like do these like basic things before bringing that conversation up? Or do you think it's like what would be the way to go about in that type of scenario?
Number one, it depends on the relationship, right? So relationships is always going to be the most foundational thing when it comes to dealing with these issues and giving dawah and preaching to others. Like, if I don't have a relationship, they're not going to listen to anything that I have to say, and it's going to come across as preachy. And if anything, I'll probably turn them away. Is there a hierarchy of deeds? Yes, there's no doubt about that. Even though I'm saying that there's no hierarchy of major sins, we understand that the major sin exists. But is there a hierarchy of good deeds? Yes, there is, right? The most important deed is believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, then praying, right? And then fasting, et cetera, right? So those hierarchy, or that hierarchy exists. Why? Because this is the way that the Prophet actually told Mu'adh to call the people of Yemen to Islam. So that same hierarchy I would focus on. I mean, I remember there's a group of brothers, they're like, yeah, this brother, he smokes and he drinks and he eats pork and da. And I was like, and like, that's what's preventing him from accepting Islam. I was like, bro, let him do all that stuff. Just let him accept Islam.
Right.
I said, maybe Allah will forgive him for that stuff. But if you get him to stop smoking and get him to stop eating pork and getting him to stop drinking, that's not going to help him in front of Allah. It'll help him in this world, but it's not going to help him in the next. So when it comes to like dealing with these issues, I feel like the nature of it's the relationship and even how we react to certain things. So there are two specific situations where I think there has to be a level of discomfort that's established in a family setting. One of those is somebody comes out as gay, right? That discomfort and that conversation needs to come up time and again, not like thrown in their face, but it needs to come up like, hey, listen, this is not something I'm with. Like, I don't support this lifestyle. The second one is a situation of like a interreligious marriage. So if you have a woman who marries a non-Muslim man, for example, in that situation, like the conversation needs to come up. Like there can never come a point where everybody's okay with it. There always has to be that level of discomfort. It doesn't mean we reject the person, right? That's very different. But we can never be openly accepting of these things. Yeah.
One thing I heard though from a scholar was that, and like this like really like terrified me. Was that for like certain things like from an Aqidah standpoint that are like, I guess, like there's complete consensus on regarding like just like LGBTQ, for example.
Yeah.
Like, there's consensus that it's like not allowed.
Yeah.
He was saying that like someone who like does not have that opinion like must take the shahada again. So like in that scenario, would you still suggest like don't bring it up? Like,
that's a very different situation. So I mean, I think we can have a class on homosexuality where you talk about it separately. No, because honestly, there's a lot of branches on the direction to move with different people depending on where they stand. So a person who advocates for it, like that person, I doubt their Islam. It's the same way I would doubt the Islam of somebody who advocates drinking alcohol or advocates zina or advocates lying, right? How can you push for something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is agreed upon is not permissible?
Some people don't
Yeah.
say that. Some people
Yeah.
genuinely think
Yeah.
that homosexuality is not haram.
Yeah, and so that's the thing. Like at this point, we have to give these people dawah the same way I would give a non-Muslim dawah, very honestly, because now you're trying to convince them of the fundamentals of Islam. So if the same way someone comes to me and be like, yeah, I don't think we have to pray. No, very honestly, like it's the same type of thing because you have those things that are obligations, you have those things that are agreed upon to be haram in the religion. You treat these in the same way for the people who deny them. Like now you have to give them dawah to actually come to Islam. And after they're convinced of that, then the conversation can go further. Whether they're doing it out of ignorance or because this is what they, in society, whatever. I mean, I'm not talking about the reasons. I'm not even judging the person, but the way the conversation goes is going to be very different. Because first you have to convince them like, no, this is anti-Islamic. Like this is not something that Islam is accepted at all. And again, like Islam doesn't accept the concept. It doesn't accept the sin, but can it accept the individual? Yeah. Right. That's different. That's a different conversation. But like I said, there's a lot of branches in this. Yeah.
I have a question with the, if you forget to do dua in the third rak'ah of Shafi with
Yeah.
Wait, are you allowed to make it afterwards?
Are you talking about qunut?
Yeah.
I don't know. Qunut is rukun or it's rukun? Yeah. Is it? Is wajib?
No, it's a sunnah. So we have rukun.
Yeah.
Sunnah.
Yeah. No, I'm saying only the Hanabila have the wajib.
We do have hayya.
Okay.
So the only thing that requires the sujood, the sahu,
Yeah.
is qunut. And
The first shahud. Okay.
So you require.
No. You just have to do sahu. So it's the same. Like for the Hanabila, you would only do sahu. For example, if you missed the tashahhud, you don't have to bring it back because it's an obligation, but it's not something that's. Yeah, it's not a pillar. It's not a rukun. Exactly. Okay. Yes, Fazil.
It's for her.
Oh, I had a question.
Yeah.
Let's say that you stub your toe and you say something profane. Are you accountable for that?
What do you guys think based on what we took? So I stubbed my toe and I'm like, oh, F, right? So is that okay?
It's not.
It's you're not Muslim. Exactly. You have to take your shahada again. No. So yeah, it's not ideal. It's makruh. It's disliked. It's just like, why? Because that profanity, is it directed at anyone? No. Right? Or even if I lose like something as simple as losing my keys, like where did I put my keys? You know what I mean? Like we saying these things that misdirected profanity, it is not desirable. It is something that's definitely disliked. But am I going to get a sin for doing it? No. Yeah.
If you miss, I've heard this, so
Yeah.
please help me. If a brother misses Jummah prayers.
Yeah.
Like more than 3 times or something.
Encourage him to go.
Does he
Yeah,
have
so-
to take shahada again?
No, so no. There's a hadith. There's a hadith. Yeah, no. The hadith is the one who misses 3 Jummahs. He's a munafiq or something like something along these lines. I don't remember the exact wording. That's
I
what
heard
al hadith. Huh?
the heart gets sealed. Allah seals the
Oh,
heart.
Allah says, yeah. I mean, something along those lines. But the other thing, again, these harsh warnings are for what? So that we don't fall into them. They're not so that we can place a hukam on a person. Right? That's not the purpose behind them. The Prophet ﷺ isn't telling us these things to be like, okay, hey, wherever you see this, make sure that you stamp a label on their forehead, right? That's not. It's like, oh, you killed someone, kafir, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's like it was a car accident, man. Like, there's nothing that's not the purpose behind those ahadith. The purpose behind ahadith is to warn the people so that they don't fall into them. It's not so that others can now use this as spiritual abuse toward them. In a very classic example of this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ. And don't say to your parents, "Uff." So who tends to use this verse? Parents. and I look to parents and I tell them, I was like, this verse isn't for you, it's for him, right? Like he has to read the verse. You can't use it against him.
But you can remind them.
I mean, you could try. Allah protects us. I'll see all of you next week, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. عليكم السلام. Oh.
You have to text him back.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. No, you're good.